Every single day, more than 1 billion people open their refrigerator, pull out last night's dinner, and reheat it without a second thought. They assume that if food is heated until it's steaming hot, it's automatically safe. In most cases, that assumption is fine, but for a handful of everyday foods, it isn't. Here is a number I want you to remember: 48 million. That is roughly how many cases of foodborne illness are reported in the United States alone every single year, according to the CDC. And a meaningful share of those cases trace directly back to something people did in their own kitchen after the food was already cooked, not before. Almost no one talks about what actually happens to certain foods between the first time they're cooked and the second time they're reheated. What happens during storage matters just as much as what happens in the pan or the microwave. You can't see it, you can't smell it, but there are changes taking place in that container sitting in your fridge, and by the time you reheat it, some of those changes can no longer be undone by heat. My name is Dr. Wellness, and today I'm going to walk you through 4 foods that you are almost certainly reheating right now. Foods that undergo real, well-documented changes during storage and reheating. Changes that food safety scientists have studied for decades. Stay with me until the end, because the 4th food on this list is one that most health-conscious people assume is completely safe to reheat, and that assumption deserves a second look. Before we go further, I want to be upfront about something. This video is not about frightening you into throwing away your leftovers. It is not about manufacturing panic over dinner. What we're talking about today is food safety science, the kind that's backed by government food safety agencies, university food science departments, and decades of laboratory testing. Some of what circulates online about reheating causing cancer is exaggerated well beyond what the research actually shows. And I want to be honest with you about where the real risk lies and where it doesn't. Because the truth is interesting enough on its own. You don't need to invent a cancer scare to explain why leftover rice deserves your attention. The real story is compelling, and it's actionable. So let's talk about what actually happens when food sits and then gets reheated. There are really 3 things going on, and I want you to keep these 3 mechanisms in mind because you'll see at least one of them show up in every food we talk about today. First, bacterial growth and toxin formation. Cooking kills most bacteria, but it doesn't sterilize food, and it definitely doesn't protect food that sits out afterward. Certain bacteria form spores that survive cooking, and once your food cools down to room temperature, those spores can wake up and start multiplying. Some of them produce toxins as they multiply, and here's the critical part. Some of those toxins are heat stable, meaning reheating the food does not destroy them. You can heat the food until it's scalding hot and the toxin is still there. Second, texture and nutrient degradation. Repeated heating breaks down proteins, denatures delicate compounds, and can strip away a portion of certain heat-sensitive vitamins, particularly B vitamins and vitamin C. This isn't dangerous in the way bacterial toxins are, but it does mean your healthy reheated meal may be less nutritious than you think, and it explains why reheated food often tastes rubbery, dry, or just different. Third, nitrate conversion in certain vegetables. This one gets misused a lot online, so I want to explain it carefully and accurately because the real story is narrower and more specific than the internet version. Certain vegetables, spinach, beets, celery, and a few others, naturally contain nitrates. Under the right storage conditions, bacteria can convert some of those nitrates into nitrites. This is a real, measurable chemical process, and it's exactly why food safety agencies in Europe and elsewhere issue specific storage guidance for these vegetables. But that guidance is aimed almost entirely at protecting infants, not general adult cancer risk, and I'll explain why when we get there. 3 mechanisms: bacterial toxins, nutrient and texture breakdown, and nitrate conversion. Keep those in mind as we go. It's worth pausing on why this even matters so much in the first place. 100 years ago, most families cooked 1 meal at a time and ate it within the hour. Refrigerators weren't common in most homes until the middle of the 20th century, which means the entire modern habit of cooking in bulk, portioning it out, and reheating it across the week is actually a fairly recent development in human history. Our kitchens caught up to the convenience long before most of us caught up to the food safety knowledge that convenience actually requires. That gap is really what this video is about. Not exotic risks, ordinary ones that live inside a habit almost everyone has normalized without ever being taught the handful of rules that make it safe. Let's start with rice. Rice is the most widely consumed staple food on the planet. Billions of people eat it every single day, and a huge number of those people cook a big batch, portion it out, and reheat it across the week. It's convenient, it's cheap, and for the most part, it's perfectly fine to do this, as long as you handle the rice correctly between the first cooking and the reheating. Here's the problem. Raw rice naturally carries spores of a bacterium called Bacillus cereus. This isn't contamination from a dirty kitchen, it's simply present in rice as it grows in the field, and it survives the cooking process because the spores are heat resistant. Cooking the rice doesn't eliminate this bacterium, it just puts it into a dormant state. If cooked rice is left out at room temperature for too long, and food safety guidance generally puts that window at around 2 hours, those spores can germinate and multiply rapidly. As the bacteria multiply, some strains produce a toxin called cereulide, and here is the part that actually matters for your reheating habits. Cereulide is remarkably heat stable. You can reheat the rice until it's steaming, and the toxin will still be there, fully active, because reheating kills the bacteria but does not break down the toxin they already released. This is a real and well-documented cause of food poisoning. It's sometimes called fried rice syndrome because it shows up so often in takeout fried rice that's been held at room temperature for hours before it's stir-fried and served. Symptoms typically appear within a few hours and include vomiting and, less commonly, diarrhea. For most healthy adults, it resolves within a day, but it can be more serious for young children, older adults, and anyone with a weakened immune system. So what should you actually do? Cool cooked rice quickly, spread it out on a shallow tray rather than leaving a deep pot to cool slowly on the counter. Refrigerate it within about an hour or two of cooking. Eat it within 3 to 4 days, and when you reheat it, make sure it's heated all the way through until it's steaming hot, not just warm. The goal isn't to avoid rice. The goal is to avoid leaving cooked rice sitting out at room temperature for hours before it goes in the fridge. One more detail worth knowing, because it changes how you should think about restaurant leftovers specifically. The classic case studies of Bacillus cereus poisoning almost always involve rice that was cooked once, held at room temperature for an extended stretch, maybe overnight in a warm kitchen, and then reheated the next day, often as fried rice. That long room temperature window is really the whole story. If you cook rice, eat some immediately, and refrigerate the rest within an hour or two, you've already removed almost all of the risk, regardless of how many times you reheat it afterward within a reasonable number of days. The danger isn't reheating itself. It's what the rice was doing in the hours before it ever went into the fridge. Now let's talk about chicken. Chicken is the world's most popular lean protein. Nutritionists, trainers, and home cooks all build meals around it, and when there's leftover chicken, almost everyone reheats it. For the most part, this is completely fine. Chicken is actually one of the safer foods to reheat as long as you do it properly. The real risk with chicken isn't some hidden chemical transformation. It's bacteria, specifically Salmonella and Campylobacter, which can be present on raw poultry and, if the chicken isn't cooked or reheated to a high enough internal temperature, can survive and cause illness. The other real risk is time. If cooked chicken sits at room temperature for more than about 2 hours, bacteria that survive cooking, or were introduced afterward through handling, can multiply to levels that reheating may not fully address, especially if the reheating is uneven. There's also a texture issue worth mentioning, since it's the thing most people actually notice. Chicken is a lean meat with relatively little fat to protect its proteins during a second round of heating. Reheat it too aggressively, particularly in a microwave, and the proteins seize up and squeeze out moisture, which is why reheated chicken so often turns out dry, rubbery, or tough. That's not a health risk. It's just chemistry working against your dinner. You may have heard claims online that reheating chicken produces dangerous compounds called heterocyclic amines, or HCAs. It's true that HCAs form when meat is cooked at very high temperatures, particularly through grilling, pan-searing, or charring, and this happens during the original cooking process, primarily at high direct heat. The evidence connecting a normal, gentle reheating of already cooked chicken to a meaningful additional HCA exposure is much thinner than the original high-heat cooking research, and I don't want to overstate it here. The bigger, well-established concern with reheated chicken is, and has always been, bacterial safety, not a hidden cancer mechanism. So what should you do? Refrigerate leftover chicken within 2 hours of cooking. Store it in a shallow, sealed container so it cools quickly and evenly. Reheat it to an internal temperature of at least 165 degrees Fahrenheit, measured with an actual food thermometer if you have one, and reheat it evenly, stirring it partway through if you're using a microwave, since microwaves are notorious for leaving cold spots. And if you're reheating chicken more than once, that's the point to stop. Each additional round of cooling and reheating adds more opportunity for bacterial growth. A quick note on bone-in chicken versus boneless, since it comes up a lot. Bone-in pieces, like thighs and drumsticks, actually tend to reheat a little more forgivingly than boneless breast, because the bone and surrounding fat help buffer the meat against drying out. If you're regularly meal prepping chicken breast and finding it turns to cardboard by day 3, that's not a storage failure on your part. It's simply that lean breast meat has very little built-in protection against a second round of heat. Adding a splash of broth or covering the container while reheating can make a real difference in texture, even though it doesn't change the underlying safety picture. The next two foods are the ones most people get wrong. One of them is a vegetable that almost every nutritionist recommends you eat more of. The other is something most people assume is either totally safe to reheat or totally unsafe. And the truth is more specific than either of those extremes. Quick pause here. If you're finding this useful, subscribe, because every week on this channel I take a piece of food safety science that's either misunderstood or exaggerated online and break down what the actual evidence says. No fear-mongering, no miracle claims, just the research and what it means for your kitchen. Let's talk about spinach and other nitrate-rich leafy greens. Spinach shows up on every list of the world's healthiest vegetables, and it deserves to be there. It's rich in iron, folate, magnesium, and antioxidants. Nutritionists are right to recommend it. The nuance most people miss is what happens to spinach specifically after it's cooked and stored, not what happens to it in general. Spinach, along with beets, celery, and a few other vegetables, naturally contains nitrates. In the plant itself, and even in your body after you eat it, dietary nitrates are actually associated with some cardiovascular benefits. They're one of the reasons beet juice became popular with endurance athletes. But once spinach is cooked and then left to sit, particularly at room temperature or under inconsistent refrigeration, naturally occurring bacteria can convert some of those nitrates into nitrites. This is a real, measurable process, and it's exactly why several public health agencies, including guidance bodies in Europe, specifically recommend that parents avoid feeding infants under 6 months old reheated or stored spinach and similar vegetables, and are cautious about it for babies under 1 year. The concern for infants is a condition called methemoglobinemia, sometimes referred to as blue baby syndrome, where elevated nitrite levels interfere with how a baby's blood carries oxygen. Infants are especially vulnerable because their digestive systems handle nitrites differently than older children and adults do. For most healthy adults and older children, occasional reheated spinach is not considered a significant health risk. Your body actually processes dietary nitrates and nitrites as part of totally normal digestion, and a serving of stored, reheated spinach is nowhere close to the exposure levels used in the studies about nitrosamine formation that get cited in scarier versions of this topic. I want to be straightforward with you about that, because the loudest version of this claim online, the one that jumps straight to cancer, stretches infant-specific guidance into a general adult warning it was never meant to be. That said, there's a simple, sensible practice here regardless. Cooked leafy greens don't hold up well in storage. They lose texture, they lose color, and they're one of the more perishable cooked vegetables in your fridge. So even without the nitrite angle, it makes sense to cook spinach in the portions you'll actually eat that day, refrigerate leftovers promptly in a sealed container, and eat them within a day or two rather than letting them sit for a week. If you're preparing food for an infant or a very young child, this is the one category where the guidance is genuinely specific. Avoid giving babies reheated or previously stored spinach, beets, or similar nitrate-rich vegetables, and prepare these fresh for them instead. For everyone else, normal food safety timelines apply. It's worth adding that this same nitrate consideration extends a little beyond spinach on its own. Baby food guidance in several countries specifically calls out home-prepared purees made from spinach, beets, carrots, and green beans, recommending they be used quickly or frozen rather than kept in the fridge for several days. If you're a parent making your own baby food rather than buying jarred versions, that's genuinely useful to know, since commercially prepared baby food is manufactured and tested under conditions designed to control exactly this kind of nitrate buildup, which is one of the practical reasons that guidance exists in the first place. I told you the last one would surprise you, and here it is. Eggs. Eggs are about as nutritionally complete as a single food gets. All 9 essential amino acids, a strong dose of choline for brain function, selenium, and antioxidants like lutein and zeaxanthin that support eye health. By almost any nutritional measure, eggs deserve their reputation. The issue with reheating eggs isn't some hidden chemical transformation that turns them carcinogenic. It's two much more ordinary things: bacteria and texture. On the bacterial side, eggs can carry salmonella, either on the shell or occasionally inside the egg itself. Cooking kills salmonella effectively, but the risk comes back into play if cooked eggs are left out at room temperature for too long before they're refrigerated, or if they're stored for an extended period before being eaten. This is exactly why food safety guidance recommends refrigerating cooked egg dishes within 2 hours and consuming them within 3 to 4 days. On the texture side, eggs are genuinely one of the trickiest foods to reheat well, and this is where most of the eggs go wrong when reheated reputation actually comes from. Egg proteins are delicate. When you reheat scrambled eggs or an omelet, especially in a microwave, the proteins that were gently set during the first cooking get pushed past that point, squeezing out moisture and turning rubbery, sometimes almost bouncy. Hard-boiled eggs can develop a slightly sulfurous smell and a chalky yolk texture when reheated too aggressively, which is a sign of overcooked protein, not a safety issue. It's unpleasant, but it isn't dangerous. You may also come across claims online about oxysterols forming in reheated eggs and posing a cancer risk. It's true that oxysterols, oxidized forms of cholesterol, can form when cholesterol-containing foods are heated, and this is a genuine area of ongoing nutrition research, particularly around highly processed, powdered, or extensively reprocessed egg products used in industrial food manufacturing. The evidence connecting a normal home-cooked egg, refrigerated properly and reheated once, to a meaningful health risk from oxysterols is nowhere near strong enough to justify the alarm this claim generates online. I'd rather tell you that plainly than dress it up. So what should you actually do? Refrigerate cooked eggs within 2 hours of cooking. If you've hard-boiled a batch for the week, keep them in their shells until you're ready to eat them. The shell helps protect the egg and slow moisture loss. When you reheat scrambled eggs or an omelet, use lower heat and shorter bursts than you think you need, stirring in between if you're using a microwave, to avoid pushing the proteins too far. And if a reheated egg dish smells noticeably sulfurous or has turned rubbery and gray at the edges, that's overcooking, not spoilage, but it's also a sign to use a gentler touch next time. There's one more egg scenario worth mentioning because it trips people up constantly. Egg-based dishes that are mixed with other ingredients, like a quiche, a frittata, or egg fried rice. These combination dishes actually deserve extra care, not because the egg component becomes more dangerous, but because you're now storing and reheating multiple ingredients with different safety profiles at once, often in a dish that's thick enough to reheat unevenly. A quiche with a dense filling can look steaming hot on the surface while the center is still lukewarm. When you're reheating anything egg-based that's mixed into a larger dish, cutting it into smaller pieces or reheating in a shallow layer rather than one thick block goes a long way toward making sure the center actually reaches a safe temperature, not just the edges. So let's bring this all together. 4 foods, 4 different practical lessons, and one theme that ties them together. What happens to food before you reheat it matters just as much as the reheating itself. With rice, the real risk is Bacillus cereus, a bacterium naturally present in raw rice that can produce a heat-stable toxin if cooked rice sits at room temperature too long. Reheating won't destroy that toxin once it's formed. The fix is fast cooling, prompt refrigeration, and eating leftovers within 3 to 4 days. With chicken, the real risk is ordinary foodborne bacteria, Salmonella and Campylobacter, combined with time spent at unsafe temperatures. The fix is refrigerating quickly, reheating to at least 165 degrees all the way through, and accepting that texture, not toxicity, is the main trade-off of a second reheat. With spinach and other nitrate-rich greens, the real, documented concern is specific to infants, where nitrate to nitrite conversion during storage can pose a genuine risk. For most adults, the bigger practical issue is simply that leafy greens don't store or reheat well texturally, so eating them fresh or within a day or two makes sense regardless. With eggs, the real risks are ordinary bacterial safety and the fact that egg proteins don't tolerate a second round of heat gracefully. Gentle reheating, proper storage timing, and realistic expectations about texture cover almost everything you need to know. Notice what's not in any of this: some hidden, silent, cumulative cancer mechanism lurking in your leftovers. That's not because I'm downplaying anything, it's because the actual, well-established science on reheated food is about bacteria, timing, temperature, and texture, and that story is genuinely useful without needing to be inflated into something scarier than it is. Here's what I want you to actually do with this information, and none of it requires special equipment or a lifestyle overhaul. Cool hot food within about 2 hours of cooking, and faster if you can. Spreading food out in a shallow container speeds this up considerably. Refrigerate promptly rather than leaving food on the counter to cool down first, which is one of the most common mistakes people make. Use your refrigerator's coldest section for anything you plan to reheat later. Reheat food until it's steaming hot all the way through, not just warm on the outside. If you're using a microwave, stir partway through to eliminate cold spots, since microwaves heat unevenly by nature. Eat most leftovers within 3 to 4 days, and when in doubt, trust your nose and your eyes before you trust the calendar. And generally, don't reheat the same dish more than once. Each cycle of cooling and reheating is another opportunity for bacteria to get a foothold. One more practical tip that makes a bigger difference than people expect. Cook portions closer to what you'll actually eat in one sitting. Smaller batches cool faster, store more evenly, and simply spend less time sitting around collecting risk. It's a small planning change, but it's the single most effective thing most people can do. I also want to mention labeling, because it sounds almost too simple to matter, but it consistently makes the biggest difference for the people who write to me about this. Grab a marker and just write the date on the container before it goes in the fridge. It takes 5 seconds, and it removes the guesswork that leads most people astray. The "I think this is from Tuesday or maybe Wednesday" moment that ends with food sitting around a day or two longer than it should. Pair that with keeping your fridge itself at or below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, checking it occasionally with a simple fridge thermometer if you're not sure, and you've covered the 2 habits that quietly prevent more foodborne illness than almost anything else on this list. Before I wrap up, I want to ask you something. Which of these 4 surprised you the most? Was it rice? Something you've probably reheated 100 times without thinking twice? Was it chicken, the safe protein that actually just needs a thermometer and a little patience? Was it spinach, where the real story turned out to be narrower than the scary version you may have heard? Or was it eggs, where the biggest issue is really just texture? Let me know in the comments, and if there's a food you'd like broken down the same way in a future video, something with a lot of scary claims attached to it online, tell me and I'll dig into the actual research.